Hello and welcome to our special coverage of Chinese President Xi Jinping's state visit to Brazil. I'm Zhong Shi in Beijing.
I'm Wang Mengmeng. President Xi will arrive soon in the Brazilian capital of Brasilia for a state visit to bolster bilateral cooperation. Earlier, he was in Rio de Janeiro attending the 19th G20 summit. And this trip is Xi Jinping's fifth visit to Brazil, which he describes as a passionate land.
We'll bring you a live feed of his arrival, along with stories of how China and Brazil have deepened their ties amid an evolving global landscape.
Well, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the establishment of their diplomatic ties, so this visit could be crucial for how the two countries chart a new path for the future.
And two guests are joining us here in the studio to provide insightful analysis on the future of the two countries' bilateral ties. They are Rafael Henrique Zerbetel, an expert at the CICG Asia Pacific Center, and Professor Jiang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our special coverage today.
Thanks for joining us.
All right, let's first check in with CGTN reporter Wu Lei, who's in Brasilia this hour. Wu Lei, what's the atmosphere where you are in the lead up to the Chinese president's arrival?
Hello, Zhongshi. We are now in the crossroads of Brasilia, the capital city of Brazil. This is the fourth largest city in Brazil and the capital city. And you can see behind me that hundreds of Chinese people are now waiting here for the arrival of President Xi Jinping. He will arrive soon here to pay a state visit to Brazil. And I just talked to some of the people here, and they said they come from Recife, another city in the north part of Brazil. They have taken a plane to arrive here to welcome the President Xi Jinping, and they said they are very excited that they want to show their warm welcome to President Xi Jinping. They have been living here for several years, and they have been benefiting from a growing friendly relationship between China and Brazil. And they said that the President Xi's visit will further boost the bilateral ties between China and Brazil. We know in recent days, President Xi has attended the G20 Leaders Summit, and he has emphasized the friendly relationship between China and Brazil. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic relationship between the two countries. And President Xi said that recent years, the food, dance, and sports, and other cultural exchanges have been another key bridge between the two countries. We know China has been Brazil's largest trading partner over the past 15 years. And in recent years, the two countries have boosted more cooperation in other fields like cultural, education, sports, and other fields. So that you can see these people are holding the national flags of China and Brazil. And they hope that the visit will be a very successful, and the two presidents will meet tomorrow, and we have special coverage, and we will be staying here to bring you more latest about the President Xi's arrival and his meeting with President Lula and other officials, and we will keep you updated in the future. Back to you.
Well, we appreciate that update from you. Of course, we will be checking in back with you later throughout our coverage. Thank you so much. Now, for more insights, joining me in the studio is Rafael Henrique Zerbetel from Brazil. He's a foreign editor of the Asia Pacific Center of China International Communications Group. We also have Professor Jiang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our special coverage today. People lining up the streets of Brasilia, obviously awaiting the arrival of the Chinese president, waving both national flags from China and Brazil, an indicator of the good momentum, the very positive momentum from the two countries. Rafael, from you first, when you look at this trip, when you monitor this trip, what do you think this state visit by the Chinese president will entail, and in what way will it contribute to China-Brazil ties?
Well, first we must remember that this year we celebrate 50 years of diplomatic relations between Brazil and China. And finally, both presidents are meeting in this special year. So it's a moment to celebrate, right? We need to celebrate everything that Brazil and China did together within those 50 years. Nowadays, Brazil and China are very important partners, and this is also a moment when we need to look forward, that we can do more in the future, that we can deepen the partnership even more. So I expect that good outcomes are being to be announced soon. So I know that there are there are signals that in the field of science and technology we can have important outcomes, including the next satellite jointly built by China and Brazil, the CBR-7. And also in agriculture, there is a ground for cooperation, many agreements in this area, benefiting both the agribusiness and also family agriculture in Brazil. Let's see what else, right? But I think the most important is synergy between the Belt and Road Initiative and Brazilian projects on infrastructure.
Well, Professor Gong, let's talk about this because this state visit comes right off the heels of President Xi Jinping's attendance of the G20 summit. President Lula hosted world leaders there in Rio de Janeiro. And of course, China and Brazil share so many things in common. They're both members of the BRICS countries. Tell us how, on this 50-year mark of their diplomatic relations, how could the two countries move forward to deepen their strategic partnership and really elevate things to a new and broader phase?
Well, let me start by mentioning that there are at least 20 world leaders attending that G20 summit. And I think it's only President Xi, at least, right, is having another separate state visit among these 20 leaders. And I think that speaks volume about how Brazil values President Xi's trip to Brazil. And I think this is actually a very special trip, marking the 50th anniversary of the two countries' diplomatic relationships. And I think China and Brazil are very special, respectively representing the largest and most important countries in the developing world, respectively in the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere, in the Southern Hemisphere and the Northern Hemisphere. So I think in that sense, the two countries' close cooperation on a range of matters, their roles in the BRICS organization highlights the importance of these two countries in the global South, in the developing world. And I think we've already mentioned there are a lot of cooperations in a range of areas that two countries be engaged in. And looking forward, I think it's pretty certain that this bilateral relationship will be taken to the next level.
Thank you for your analysis, gentlemen. And before heading to Brasilia for state visit, President Xi is in Rio de Janeiro for the G20 Leaders Summit, which saw the launch of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. President Xi Jinping also delivered speech on building a just world of common development. CGTN's Chen Ziyuan reports.
Calling for more bridges of cooperation, Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered speeches about world hunger and government reform on the first day of the G20 Leaders Summit on Monday.
I have worked in China's villages, counties, cities, provinces and the central government. Poverty alleviation has been an important part of my work and a major issue that I aspire to solve. China's journey out of poverty has shown that with resilience and perseverance, the issue of poverty in developing countries can be solved, and that the weak birds can fly early and soar high. If China can make it, other developing countries can make it too. This is a global significance of China's success in winning the battle against poverty.
President Xi told the gathering in Rio, China will always be a member of the Global South, a reliable long-term partner of fellow developing countries, and a doer and go-getter working for the cause of global development.
With the launch of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, President Xi announced China's participation and outlined China's 8 actions for global development.
These 8 actions include pursuing high-quality Belt and Road cooperation, implementation of the Global Development Initiative, supporting development in Africa, supporting international cooperation on poverty reduction and food security, proposing the initiative on international cooperation in open science to help the Global South with Brazil, South Africa, and African Union, supporting the G20 in anti-corruption action plan, and open doors wider to the least developed countries. The steps include a financial commitment of 80 billion yuan, around $11 billion in the Silk Road Fund, and nearly 360 billion yuan, which it is about $50 billion to support African development.
China, it's a big country and it's a big country around the world. When China has a commit to something, I think it's make easy to other countries to do it. Now I just hear in his speech he's have a comment to solve the poor countries and poor people, also through the Silk Road, that China built it now. It will cross so many countries, so many cities around the world. When China focus to help this community to improving their economy, that will help,
Well, all of them. I mean, because China's self-identity as a country is still as a global South country, right? China sees itself as a leader of the global South, and I think it's really important that the relationships that China has established with African countries, in particular over the last maybe 20, 25 years, those investment relationships are really significant in terms of supporting China's own transformation, but also in terms of transforming local economies in Africa as well. And it seems to me that commitment to sharing the benefits of a kind of increasingly Chinese-led globalization is really significant.
President Xi said, China is ready to take steps together with all parties to build a just world of common development, leave poverty in the past, and turn our vision into reality. Chen Ziyuan, CGTN, Rio de Janeiro.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has also called on G20 members to work together to build a fair and equitable global governance system.
President Xi stressed that mankind lives in a community with a shared future. He said G20 members should see each other's development as opportunities rather than challenges, and view each other as partners rather than rivals. He also said the group should observe the basic norms of international relations underpinned by the UN Charter and defend international order based on international law. President Xi highlighted 5 aspects of global governance for a better world economy. First, he called for improving global economic governance and promoting cooperation. Xi Jinping urged reinforcement of macro policy coordination, cultivation of new quality productive forces, and raising total factor productivity. Xi also says international financial institutions and commercial creditors need to take part in debt reduction and suspension for developing countries. Second, they should improve global financial governance and ensure stability. President Xi said developing countries need greater voice and representation. He said joint efforts are needed to keep the international financial market stable and prevent negative spillover of domestic monetary policy adjustments. He said developed countries should fulfil their responsibilities in this regard. Third, he urged improving global trade governance and enhancing openness. President Xi voiced opposition against unilateralism and protectionism. He urged the restoration of the dispute settlement mechanism as soon as possible. He called for incorporating the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement into the WTO legal framework. He also expressed hope for an early consensus on the e-commerce agreement. Fourth, President Xi highlighted efforts to improve global digital governance and build a world economy characterised by innovation. He stressed the need to step up international governance and cooperation on artificial intelligence to ensure that AI is used for good and is for all. And fifth, President Xi said the G20 needs to improve global ecological governance and build a world economy characterised by eco-friendliness. Xi called on developed countries to provide financial, technological and capacity-building support to developing countries. Regarding security, President Xi said global security governance is part of global governance. He said the G20 should support the UN and its Security Council in playing a greater role in global security. To de-escalate the Ukraine crisis, the Chinese president said China and Brazil, together with other global South countries, launched the group of Friends for Peace to bring together more voices for peace. President Xi also stressed the urgency for all sides to stop fighting in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He pointed out that the fundamental way out of the cycle of conflict lies in the implementation of the two-state solution, the restoration of Palestine's legitimate national rights, and the establishment of an independent state of Palestine.
Well, following this visit for us is our correspondent Dan Williams, and he joins us live now from Brasilia. Well, great to see you there, Dan. This is President Xi Jinping's 5th trip to Brazil, and we saw earlier that people were lining up the streets to welcome him. How is, how are the locals taking the news of his trip there at this time?
Yeah, certainly there's a whole host of colour now around the main city part of Brasilia now, with all those flags that we saw going up earlier today. And the people that I've been speaking to, there's a real sense, if you like, that this is a very important visit, and certainly one that they hope will continue to strengthen the relationship between Brazil and China. Overwhelmingly, the key message to seemingly to be highlighted by many of those that I've been speaking to is the business and employment opportunities that come from this special relationship that's been developing, perhaps if more so in recent times. Earlier I caught to Tassiana Silva Negreiros. Now she says that she welcomes this trip. She says it's important for Brazil to have these kind of relationships with all of the large countries, but especially she's looking forward to seeing how this can further strengthen the relationship in terms of the global south. And she also hopes that this will, that Brazil and China can continue to strengthen in terms of finding a way through climate change and finding sustainable solutions to that. And she pointed towards how she feels that solar is one key area that Brazil and China can do more on in the future. And I also spoke to Rafael Capello. Now he's a Brasilia local who says he can't wait to try and catch a glimpse of President Xi Jinping's visit here as well. But he also again emphasized that important element of employment, the industry that has been created. Of course, China is Brazil's main trading partner and has been for 15 straight years, and we've been seeing that uptick over the course more recent times as well. So there's a real sense, if you like, among the locals that I've been speaking to, that this is an important trip, and certainly that this state visit here, that there's a real sense of occasion to this as well.
Dan, following the latest for us from Brasilia, thank you so much for that update. President Xi also presented 8 actions by China to support global development at the first session of the G20 summit. Analysts say that this establishes China's commitment to openness and helping developing nations.
I think it's very good that President Xi has come up with these 8 actions, because they enable China to position itself as a country who is interested in rules-based trade and investment, sustainable development, and international cooperation. And there are signs that China is being seen as a more reliable partner. We noted that on the margins of the G20 meeting. Now, with respect to the G20 summit, the real 2 big priorities, I think, are climate change and poverty reduction. Practical steps that President Xi has taken among his 8 actions do a lot to help reduce global poverty. First of all, I would point to the 8th action, which is tariff-free access to China for least developed countries. I think this stands in great contrast to what we think Donald Trump will be doing when he becomes president. There's also been a commitment of 360 billion Chinese yuan in support for African countries. So I think this is very, very positive to help with poverty reduction.
Dessas 8 propostas, todas elas são bastante interessantes.
China's proposal of 8 actions for global development is intriguing. China is pursuing high-standard opening up. It also joined the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty to help the least developed countries, which is a very noble initiative. China's decision to open its doors wider to the least developed countries is very important because it has successful experience in fighting poverty and hunger. China has always strived to fight poverty and hunger, making great contributions for the least developed countries.
President Xi led off in his speech at the G20, talking in terms of we need to create bridges and not create small yards and high fences. And the first part of his speech was focused very much on maintaining openness, globalization, and multilateralization. And I think in this day and age, there's no question that these are very, very important ideas which not just need to be preserved, but for which one needs to fight for to maintain them, especially at a time when we see the shadows of populism and protectionism. There is no question building barriers, building bridges is far more important than creating barriers.
Now let's pick up our conversation with our guests here in the studio. Gentlemen, I do want to briefly review the G20 summit where both China and Brazil are members. Brazil obviously took advantage of its presidency there to put forward the priorities that it deems are essential, not just for China and Brazil, but for Global South. Proposing that global alliance against hunger and poverty. Professor Gong, why does it matter for Brazil to put this on the agenda?
Well, I think it has to go back to the original purpose of G20. It was designed initially as a means to coordinate macroeconomic policies. But over time, I think the role of G20 has really evolved, has more focused on development. I think ever since the 2016 G20 summit in China. And I think ever since then, the scope of G20 has really broadened. And I think it's now, this time, Brazil is emphasizing the importance of fighting against hunger and food security and poverty. I think this is actually a manifestation of how this agenda has been broadened to reflect the interests of the developing countries, because this is really what the Global South, a lot of countries in the Global South are really concerned about. And I think if you look at the President Xi's 8-action plan, I think it speaks directly to President Lulu's call for fighting against poverty and hunger, right? And one of the items that he mentioned is precisely about this. And it's actually not just lip service. It's actually backed by real money, real projects. He talks about the commitment from China to address that issue. It's really a contribution to the international community, in my view, especially those poor countries in the Global South.
And this alliance against poverty and hunger, Mr. Zapato, there are some requirements for funding, of course, and then there are some initiatives taking place. For example, offering meals to children at school under the age of, I believe it's above 6 and under 18 years of old. Some of these experiences are cases that China have promoted in the past during its poverty alleviation effort. Tell us, how could the two countries work on this together?
Well, that the book from President Xi Jinping, Up and Out of Poverty, it was launched in Brazil, in Brazilian version, was launched last week. So now it's easier for people in Brazil to have access to the experience of China on poverty alleviation that is unique. Brazil succeeded before in the government of Dilma Rousseff, like after 2 terms of President Lula, to get out from the world map of hunger, but later came back, because of changes in the public policies in Brazil and now President Lula wants to fight hunger again. He came back for this. That's the fight of his life. He wants to eradicate hunger, not only from Brazil, but also help other countries in that. And China is on the same way. China succeeded to eradicate extreme poverty in its territory. And now China is also trying to help other countries to leave poverty, to also reach a higher level of development. And the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, creates jobs, stimulates exports from other countries. President Xi remembered in the G20 that China is not requesting taxes from imports from those less developed countries in order to help those countries to export more. So there are many ways that we can cooperate in that. I think the work done by China in poverty alleviation is really impressive, because the population is so big, and also because it was very detailed work, like making specific solutions for specific cases. So Brazil has much to learn from China.
Of course. Now, let's further talk about this. During an exclusive interview with CMG, Wang Guan, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva reveals that the upcoming state visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping could be the most important one since the establishment of the bilateral relationship 50 years ago. Highlighting China's vital contributions to Brazil's energy transition, he also emphasizes Brazil's willingness to deepen its partnership with China, which will bring benefits not just to both nations, but to the entire world.
I heard that there had been quite a bit of thinking, quite a bit of preparation going into that state visit.
Olha, eu acho que essa reunião ela vai ser possivelmente a reunião mais importante já feita entre Brasil e China. Nós temos, sabe, pensamentos comuns. A China é o mais extraordinário país no mundo asiático. O Brasil é o maior país da América Latina. Nós temos muitas afinidades e nós queremos compartilhar com a China aquilo que nós temos especialidade e a China compartilhar com o Brasil aquela que tem especialidade. E eu acho que vai ser uma parceria, sabe, excepcional entre Brasil e China. Nós vamos mudar e aprimorar a nossa relação.
We're marking the 50th anniversary of China-Brazil relationship. Our two countries are working very closely together. Brazil is now the largest Chinese EV export destination, and the Chinese approach is increasingly becoming made in Brazil for Brazil. BYD setting up a shop in Bahia State, Great Wall Motors setting up a factory in the state of Sao Paulo. How do you see these Chinese-Brazilian partnerships contributing to the reindustrialization plan and green transition plan that you set for Brazil?
Eu acho extraordinário e trabalho muito para que isso aconteça. Eu, essa semana, fiquei muito feliz porque eu fiquei sabendo que a BYD, na Bahia, ela vai ter 20 mil funcionários. Ela vai produzir carros de bateria para exportar para outros países. E isso é muito importante para um país do tamanho do Brasil. Isso é muito importante porque as outras indústrias automobilísticas que tem no Brasil vão ser motivadas também a fazer grandes investimentos para que o mundo se transforme mais competitivo. Hoje eu recebi uma boa notícia. O Brasil, esse mês, bateu recorde de produção de automóveis. Olha, isso é um começo muito importante. Então, se a gente puder fortalecer essa relação China e Brasil, e aqui tiver mais indústria produzindo para exportar, trazendo tecnologia, produzindo bateria, discutindo, sabe, a questão espacial, se a gente estiver discutindo inteligência artificial, sabe, é tudo muito maravilhoso para o Brasil, para a China e para o mundo. Porque o Brasil tem interesse em compartilhar o seu crescimento com os países vizinhos.
Earlier, Brazilian newspaper Folha de Sao Paulo published an article titled "A Friendship Spanning Vast Oceans, a Voyage Toward a Brighter Shared Future" by Chinese President Xi Jinping. Our correspondent Paulo Cambril has the details.
In the Sunday's edition of Folha de São Paulo, the largest Brazilian newspaper in terms of subscribers, readers were provided first-hand views of Chinese President Xi Jinping on the relationship between his country and Brazil. In the article, President Jinping highlighted the 50 years of diplomatic relations between Brazil and China, celebrated this year. Looking ahead, the Chinese leader stated that the two nations need to continue exchanging experiences in governance and development while strengthening strategic trust between them.
I think that Mr. Xi and his helper, he sends a message that China wants to be a stable and a trustworthy partner and looks forward to enhancing this relation, this connection.
The article was also published on Folha de São Paulo's website, which is part of the Universo online portal, one of the most accessed portals in the country.
Folha is Brazil's leading newspaper, so it's natural for us to try always to provide our readers with important and best content possible. So obviously an op-ed by one of the most important leaders in the world is newsworthy of.
You as a journalist specialized in international affairs, what's your evaluation of the current status of China-Brazil relationship and how do you see this going into the future?
If you consider these 50 years of formal relations since 1974, it's obviously that we will have these ups and downs in terms of politics, especially depending on the Brazilian government in power. But I think that in a broader picture, we can consider that it's clear for us, and I think for China as well, that it has been mostly a win-win relation.
As President Xi Jinping arrives in Brazil for the G20 summit and a state visit, important insights into how the Chinese leader views relations with Brazil have already been shared in this article. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, Rio de Janeiro.
And our reporter Xi Jinping caught up with Brazilian Senator Teresa Cristina on how the two of the major developing nations can further expand cooperation.
Senator Cristina, thanks for speaking with us. So first, let's talk about China and Brazil. Trade is definitely one of the strongest aspects in terms of the two countries' relationship, exceeding $180 billion of trade a year. We're also witnessing that there is a growing interest from Chinese firms to invest in Brazil. And what are the sectors showing the maximum, the most potential, in your opinion?
China is already a major investor in the power sector in Brazil, especially in energy generation and distribution. But the sectors that still need to be developed are logistics and infrastructure. So although there already is Chinese investment in ports, I think that there is a lot that could be done to further increase Chinese investments in logistics. Because Brazil really needs that as an agricultural exporter.
Enorme de crescimento, tanto em ferrovias, hidrovias e rodovias. Então, eu acho que esse ponto ainda está em aberto, né, para os investimentos chineses, que eu tenho certeza que serão bem-vindos.
Brazil hosts this year's G20 meeting, and Brazil and China are two leading economies in the global south. So from BRICS to G20, we can see nowadays that the global south is playing a bigger role in global governance. So in your opinion, how can these growing ties between China and Brazil bring peace and stability to today's world?
Eu acho que são duas potências.
I think Brazil and China are two gigantic countries in their respective regions. China here in Asia and Brazil there in South America. So these two countries should definitely work together to promote peace and stability. Especially looking at China's pragmatism and China's ability to have a pragmatic and peaceful approach to things. So the two countries should definitely cooperate further for this to happen.
And this year marks the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and Brazil. Bilateral ties between two of the world's biggest emerging economies continue to flourish.
Brazil, the largest country in South America, is a land of vibrant culture, rich biodiversity and a booming economy. Known for its natural wonders like the Amazon rainforest and its lively carnival, Brazil also stands as a powerful force in global trade and diplomacy. China is Brazil's largest trading partner, with trade between the two nations reaching new heights each year. Brazil exports vast amounts of soybeans, iron ore and oil to China, fueling China's massive industrial economy. In turn, Brazil imports technology, machinery and electronics, creating a mutually beneficial exchange.
We intend to discuss with the Chinese a new strategic partnership between Brazil and China, a strategic partnership that involves not only the export of commodities, but also includes collaboration in science and technology.
Just as President Lula said, the partnership goes beyond trade. China and Brazil have strengthened their collaboration through the BRICS group of emerging economies. The two countries have cooperation agreements in IT, biotech, agriculture, aquaculture and healthcare. In the aerospace sector, the China-Brazil Earth Resources Satellite Project has jointly launched 6 satellites so far. The two sides also have dynamic cultural and people-to-people exchanges. Since February 2024, China and Brazil have agreed to grant 10-year visas for each other's citizens for business, leisure trips and family visits. With shared interests in sustainable development, Brazil and China are forging a partnership that shapes the future of international relations.
Well, apparently bilateral ties are flourishing in so many ways. And now let's get some more analysis from our guests here. So President Xi Jinping said that this visit could strengthen mutual trust between the two sides, and as well as deepen exchanges and cooperation in various fields. So Professor Gong, help us understand how the relations between China and Brazil have flourished, have expanded into more areas over the years.
Well, I think first of all, the number of times President Xi has visited Brazil speaks volume about the closeness of the two countries. And he has a characterization of the country is very passionate about Brazil. So I think this is a great thing to see. Now, in terms of areas of cooperation, I think what's unique about this kind of a cooperation is that it's not just at a superficial level. I think it's getting into very high-tech areas. For example, China and Brazil cooperated in outer space, for example, right? Brazil is noted for its aviation industry. It's actually also helping China to build the state-of-the-art airplanes. This kind of a cooperation is really seen among a lot of countries. So I think this is actually a very special relationship.
Sure. Well, Professor, let's now hear from my colleague Chen Ziyuan, who's joining us at the airport where Chinese President Xi Jinping expected to land shortly. So Ziyuan, what can we expect from President Xi's agenda in Brasilia?
Well, President Xi Jinping has wrapped up his agenda at the G20 summit and will be touched on very soon at the Brazilian capital, Brasilia, on Tuesday. And this is another visit by him since 2019. What we're seeing here is that Brazilian President Lula will be hosting a welcoming ceremony as well as welcoming banquet for him. Both leaders will be witnessing the signing and exchanges of cooperation document, and they will also be meeting with the press. Meanwhile, I want to share with you that China is Brazil's largest trading partner, and Brazil is China's ninth largest trading partner. What we are seeing here on the ground is that, for example, China and Brazil co-developed the Earth resources satellite. So this is some of the cooperation as a leading example of the South-South cooperation. And currently, China and Brazil is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties. So we're seeing the connection and cooperation is going to be tightened as President Xi Jinping will be arriving here at the Brazilian capital. And meanwhile, on the ground here, the chief of staff of the Brazilian government to President Lula's, Roy Costa, will be here to welcome President Xi Jinping's and upon his arrival. And that's all I have for now. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Ziyuan, for that update. We have 3 teams of reporters covering the state visit, and we'll be checking with him later on in this program.
Now, Mr. Zerbetel, we talked about how China and Brazil are representative of the emerging economies, developing countries, respectively, in the East and in the West. How important is this bilateral relationship for the global South?
Well, both Brazil and China are, some of the biggest emerging economies in the world. We also represent a bigger portion of the world population. And also Brazil and China are aligned in topics like, for example, supporting multilateralism and supporting reforms of Bretton Woods institutions, and so on. So it's clear that Brazil and China are committed with the Global South. We have this understanding. Brazil and China, I feel it's like both countries are trying to recover the Bandung spirit, and this is something very relevant in our time. We have an international situation very complicated with the risks of a third world war being mentioned more and more in everyday life, people concerned about possible conflicts. And Brazil and China are focused in promoting cooperation. We always share this message that the world can give opportunities for all, that we can cooperate rather than disputing, and share the benefits.
you see a lot of synergy between China and Brazil when it comes to supporting each other in international affairs. China obviously was very supportive of the global alliance this time, the idea proposed by Brazil. And Brazil is also very supportive of China when it comes to elevating the global south, and getting their voices heard in the world. Professor Gong, help us understand just the significance of these two large developing countries working together, not just for the sake of themselves, but also for other members of the global south.
Absolutely. I think the two countries' cooperation goes well beyond just economic ties. I think in political areas, even in security, there's a close relationship between the two countries. I mean, the two countries play a vitally important role under the BRICS framework. Now remember, there's also another very good example here. China and Brazil jointly put out a peace plan for Ukraine. And this is actually taking a leadership role, representing the global south, representing the global the developing countries. They want to voice their opinion about how to resolve this conflict in Ukraine. And I think the fact that the two countries put a peace plan on the table, and also organized a alliance of countries, the peace, friends of peace for Ukraine. This is something very, very significant, I think. And this is also in parallel with the efforts in Europe, in Washington, trying to resolve this conflict. So I think, from that point of view, definitely the two countries are the leaders in global affairs and global matters, in political spheres, in security spheres, and that's speaks volume about the level of cooperation between the two countries.
And I think it's interesting to see that even though Brazil is not a partner country of the Belt and Road Initiative, but that really hasn't hampered the cooperation between China and Brazil from going forward and expanding into more areas. You mentioned the synergy just now. Tell us more about how these two countries are trying to explore more areas where they can work on to build on their past achievements and find some more new momentum for growth.
Okay, you know that in ancient times in South America there was a trail connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was called the Piabiru Trail. So ancient peoples in the Americas, before the arrival of Europeans, they used that trail to cooperate, to exchange not only goods but also knowledge. And so this was there was a big exchange between the peoples there. It's like similar to the Silk Road here. So now that China is using the spirit of the Silk Road as an inspiration for the BRI, I feel that in South America we have a feeling that it's time to reconstruct the Piabiru Trail, in a symbolic way, because especially for Brazil is a country facing the Atlantic, and since the last century, the last 5 centuries, when the Portuguese arrived in Brazil, Brazilian economy is always focused in exporting to Europe, to US, so always along the Atlantic. And also the opportunities, the international trade was essentially along the Atlantic. But now the center of gravity of the world economy is going to the Pacific. So Brazil must look to the Pacific, must find easier access to China and other Asian markets. And for that, we need connections, to the Pacific. So this year, the Brazilian government launched a plan to set 5 routes connecting Brazil to ports in the Pacific, including the Chancay port, just inaugurated in Peru. Chancay port is also an important mark because now you can have a route connecting Chancay to Shanghai, as it was said in the inauguration. So it shortens the distance, reduces the costs to export, so Brazilian products can be more competitive in China. And we can expect more exchanges, and same as it happened along the Piabiru Trail.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Zabetel. We're picking up pictures of the Chinese president's plane about to land in Brasilia. We're monitoring this for you live on CGTN. The Chinese president is about to land in Brasilia after completing the G20 agenda in Rio de Janeiro. Upon his arrival, he will hold bilateral meetings with his Brazilian counterpart, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva.
And as we mentioned earlier, this will be Chinese President Xi Jinping's 5th trip to Brazil. The two countries are half a world away, but they are seeing more cooperation expanding into different sectors.
And earlier we saw people lining up the streets in Brasilia awaiting the Chinese president. A lot of friendly momentum, a lot of friendly atmosphere. Now the plane has touched down and is taxiing on the runway there at the airport.
So President Xi Jinping has officially arrived in Brasilia for his state visit there. He will hold bilateral meetings with his Brazilian counterpart, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. And we expect to see senior Brazilian officials greeting the Chinese president at the airport. And we have 3 teams of reporters covering the state visit this time for you in Brasilia.
And gentlemen, we were watching that interview where the Brazilian official said there has been ample cooperation between China and Brazil when it comes to energy transitions, building up the capacity for power lines, for example, in Brazil. But what's lacking is infrastructure and logistics. Professor Gong, can I just pick your brain on this? Why this lack of infrastructure? I mean, China, if it comes to cooperation with a foreign country, infrastructure is the go-to option. But in the case of Brazil, this is lacking, and how do we make up for it?
Well, I think these are very large projects involving a lot of money, and I think there's got to be some kind of a process that to go through in Brazil. It probably involves domestic politics. So I think these things are waiting to be happen. I think in the end, Brazil, as you just mentioned, that Brazil needs access to the Asia Pacific area, and the logistics, ports, railroads, highways. These are vitally important to support a trade between Brazil and the Far East. So I think these things probably take a little bit of time. But I think even though, let me put it this way, even though China and Brazil don't officially have a Belt and Road MOU signed so far, but in substance, these projects are already happening. So I think. We probably will be more focused on the real substance here. As long as these projects are happening, the formality really doesn't matter too much, I think. My understanding is that this has something to do with the domestic politics in Brazil. But nevertheless, I think the cooperation in infrastructure projects are already happening, and it will happen in the future. So I think we're on the right track, and this kind of a cooperation will continue.
And this connectivity, greater connectivity, as Mr. Zabeto just mentioned, railways and highways linking Brazil to other parts of the world. Instead of looking into the Atlantic, they're now moving to the Pacific Ocean and onto China. We know that railways are being built, highways are being built in the west of the country, linking it to the Shanghai port. Why is it important for Brazil's economy as well as its outreach to the rest of the world?
Well, for example, I saw that recently I was in Shanghai for CIIE, and I had a talk with the governor, Marcos Rocha, from Rondônia State in Brazil. And he told me that nowadays they export coffee beans to China, but from Rondônia to Santos port in Brazil, in the Atlantic, it takes 7 days so just to carry it to the port and bring it to China from the Atlantic. But now from Shanghai port, Rondônia is in the Amazon, it's already closer to the Pacific than to the Atlantic. They can take only 1.5 days to reach Shanghai port. And then from there to China, it's also fast, the transportation. So the beans can come in China fresher, and Chinese will be able to enjoy better the taste and the flavor, right? So this is, I feel like the development of Brazil, nowadays, it will depend a lot on the partnerships with China. Because, for example, this year BYD opened a factory in Brazil. China is a key partner in the Brazilian energy transition, investing in many energy projects in Brazil, and is a partner in many sectors, and this partnership tends to become bigger in the future. So it's a natural thing. You know, Brazil needs connection deeper with China.
I think that BYD factory is the largest operation outside of Asia. How important is it for the industrialization drive for the country?
Yeah, this is a very important topic because, you know, many Chinese companies are investing in manufacturing in Brazil. So this is the point, you know, that China nowadays, Chinese companies are expanding around the world and creating opportunities in other countries.
Sure. As we speak right now, we are still seeing live pictures from Brasilia, where Chinese President Xi Jinping has just touched down for his state visit there. And he will be hold bilateral meetings with Brazilian President Lula.
It looks like the plane is taxiing to a stop there. We should expect to see the Chinese president emerge from the plane momentarily. Make sure you stay with us right here on CGTN as we bring you the latest on the Chinese president's state visit to Brazil.
This is significant because the visit comes as the two countries are marking the 50th anniversary of the establishment of bilateral relations.
And in a written statement upon the president's arrival in Rio de Janeiro, he voiced his hope that the visit will further strengthen the two countries' strategic mutual trust, deepen exchanges and cooperation in various fields, and usher in a new golden 50 years for bilateral relations.
And having said that, President Xi says this relationship between China and Brazil sets a model for major developing countries to develop win-win cooperation and pursue a shared future. Professor Gong, how should the two countries further work together to usher in the next 50 years of diplomatic relations?
Well, I think first of all, we need to deepen the economic ties. Two economies are fairly complementary towards each other with further investments and also further trade. I think the economic ties would be just strengthened even more. And I think the cooperation needs to expand into other areas as well. And I think President Xi mentioned this in his speech yesterday, that the G20 platform needs to expand in scope into other areas. And in that effort, I think China and Brazil play a critical role in pushing that agenda. So I think we've just talked about cooperation in political arenas, in international relations, in striving for peace and security areas. So all of the things I think should be continuing. And I also want to mention that the BRICS platform, the BRICS mechanism, I think there are real projects of substance, real actions taking place under the BRICS umbrella. And I think China and Brazil are taking a leadership role in realizing these big projects going on. For example, the inter-member country trade settlement bypassing the U.S. dollar, for example, is of vital importance to me. And I think China and Brazil are playing a kind of a leadership role in realizing that vision, right? So these are the concrete projects and actions that the two countries are cooperating on. And I think this kind of a cooperation should expand into many more areas.
Let me get a question in about trade, Mr. Zabetel. And for our viewers watching that are less familiar with this topic, Brazil exports agricultural products to China. We're talking about soybeans, coffee, and iron ores. And China exports manufactured goods to Brazil. We're talking about mechanical and electrical products. With a state visit of this level, of this caliber, leaders often talk about expanding trade. What is the potential there for expansion? How can we get this trade relationship to a higher level, Mr. Zabetel?
Well, first, I see that China is in need to import more in the future. For example, the Chinese government has a plan to insert 40 million people, I think, in the middle income group until 2035, right? So, of course, this means the consumption of China will grow, and then we will need to import more. And China, for example, the CIIE that happened early this month, it's exactly focused in that, in providing China, the Chinese consumers, the products that China needs. So Brazil can grow its exports. Now the Brazilian government has plans, for example, to recover some areas, some rural areas that are not being in use, so to grow its agricultural expansion. But the most important agenda of President Lula now for exports is the reindustrialization of Brazil. He wants Brazil to add value to its production.
Well, I want to add that Brazil is actually not just exporting raw materials and agricultural products. It has a very vulnerable aviation industry, which is highly advanced in my view. China actually buys quite a bit of embryo airplanes. We see these planes in our airline companies. Definitely Brazil has its fair share of high-tech industry as well.
Mr. Zerbetel, can you share a little bit about what Brazilian products were highlighted at the CIIE this year? What Brazilian products are hoping for a bigger share in the Chinese market?
Yes, the Brazilian state Mato Grosso, they highlight their local production. They produce mainly beef, but also beans and soy. So they share their production. And the Brazilian state of Rondônia, they brought their coffee. This is the Amazonia Robusta. It's a very specific kind of coffee because in most producers, they make Arabica. In Brazil, in southern Brazil, they produce Arabica, but in Rondônia, they produce this specific kind of Robusta adapted to the Amazon climate. I saw that Brazilian producers of Arabica coffee, they are also very focused in expanding their trade with China. I also saw a raw material for paper, the Suzano company, and iron ore from Vale. And also other companies, for example, Tramontina is a Brazilian company making pans, making utensils for kitchen, and also tools. They are trying to expand in Chinese market. Also shoes. Brazilian shoes are popular in China. Basically those items. But I also saw that in the sector for innovation this year, some Brazilian startups were there showing what they have to offer, and they have very interesting projects like in green energy, in medicine, and so on, looking for investments and partners in China to develop together, in partnership with China, launch their products in the market.
Thanks to the CIIE and perhaps other channels to promote trade, my colleague Zhong Shi was there in Shanghai covering the CIIE, and I think that consumers from China will be more familiar with products from Brazil through these channels. So trade between the two countries has increased by nearly 10% in the first 10 months of this year. It's really gaining momentum, but is there more to it? Help us break down the structure of this trade. What are some of the top items that China is also exporting to Brazil? Professor Gong.
If I remember this correctly, Brazil is probably, China-Brazil trade is probably the fastest growing, if not the fastest, second fastest probably, among all China's trading partners. It was, I think 2023 was $180 billion. I think it ranks like probably the fifth or sixth largest trading partner for China. So it's actually a very significant piece, and it's actually rising very rapidly. Now, in terms of what other products the Chinese companies trying to sell in Brazil, I think all manufacturing products are finding their markets over there. One example I know of is that a very large brand of a cell phone company here in China is trying to establish their presence in Brazil. Oppo, I don't know, any Oppo phones in Brazil so far? I mean, they're trying to expand their footprints in Brazil. Huawei has been working in Brazil for quite a few years, I think, right? For many years. These are the strength of Chinese companies, and other kinds of, I would imagine, consumer electronics, these kind of products. These are Chinese companies are fairly dominant. Another area that I see a great future are products related to addressing the climate change, like the solar products, right? I mean, Chinese companies are really dominant in that space. Brazil has a lot of sunshine, I would imagine, and definitely, the transition towards a cleaner energy paradigm calls for cooperation between Chinese companies and the Brazilian partners. So I think these are products, examples that Chinese companies can establish their markets in Brazil.
Sure.
Stay on this topic, and we were, talking about how BYD has a huge operation in Brazil, which indicates that it values the market in Brazil. Mr. Zerbeto, can you talk about how attractive is the Brazilian market for Chinese new energy brands like BYD, the reasons behind it choosing to have such an enormous operation in Brazil?
Well, it's simply because the new energy cars is something new in Brazil nowadays. It's an industry that is developing, and when you consider that the consuming market in Brazil is one of the biggest in the world and the biggest in the southern hemisphere, and also that Brazil is part of Mercosur, it has very good relations with its neighbors. So Brazil exports a lot to neighbor countries as well, with facilitated conditions. So this creates a good environment for those companies in Brazil. So simply the fact that the Brazilian market itself is pretty big for them, and many Brazilians are into buying new energy cars.
They are?
Yeah. In that interview with Wang Guan, President Lulu mentioned that BYD cars manufactured in Brazil are not just for the domestic market, actually. They're actually exporting these cars to neighboring countries. So he's actually very happy about it, President Lulu, right?
So it's a gateway to other Latin American countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is the one characteristic of the manufacturing industry. You need a very large market to sustain sort of a large operation. And it's kind of very difficult for a small country with a small market to establish a automobile manufacturing facility, and the fact that it's located in Brazil, I think, is for a reason. And in addition to satisfying the Brazilian market, these cars can be, by the way, exported to neighboring countries. And I think this is also the one of the very important factors of consideration by the Brazilian authority why it wants to attract companies like BYD into the Brazilian market, because they're also targeting exports as well.
Do we have an approximate figure of how investments like this would create jobs? How many jobs would it mean for the locals?
I think, if I remember this correctly, President Lulu also mentioned, he said 20,000 jobs, right, in that interview.
Yeah, something like that.
I think he mentioned 20,000 jobs associated with the BYD factory in Brazil. So that's a very significant number, right? A lot of people are going to be very happy.
It's becoming a manufacturing hub that obviously exports to neighboring countries. So it's a significant step. Another thing I want to shed light on is a lesser known aspect of this relationship, the scientific and technology aspect. You mentioned satellite. China and Brazil have been working on. What other items should we highlight in this area when it comes to scientific cooperation?
Biofuels, last year I visited a lab here in Tsinghua University. They have a cooperation with a research center of a Brazilian university. Brazil is the first country to develop a technology for cars to move by ethanol. This is common in Brazil for a long time. And more recently, Brazil developed a technology for biodiesel as well. And then, this professor told me that there are many exchanges between Brazil and China in this sector, and it's good for both sides. So they can exchange and learn together and develop new products together in technology.
Ethanol-powered cars is a great success story, I think, in Brazil. It's mainly because Brazil is a large producer of sugarcane. And because of the sugarcane, they turn it into ethanol, and they used ethanol to power the car. And it was actually very successful. That's my understanding of it.
Yes, it was successful. And it was linked to a moment when the price of oil was very high, and Brazil had to import it. So Brazil developed an alternative, and this alternative is more sustainable.
Yeah, so it's not difficult to see that the two countries have been trying to expand their trade structure to include some more items. So, Professor Gong, what is your, give us a sense of your prospect for bilateral trade going forward? What would be the new focus?
I think the trade increase is going to continue at the current pace, which is actually, probably the highest increase percentage. And there are, as I said, there's a huge market over there. We're going to find more and more Chinese companies moving over that market, try to sell their products. And I think, China's demand for traditionally strong Brazilian products is going to continue, like iron ore, like what else? I mean, the soybean, agricultural products. These things will definitely continue. As a matter of fact, I know that actually Chinese companies going to Brazil, and they acquire land in Brazil to plant soybeans, right? And they do this on a massive scale. So I think this kind of a demand and supply is actually quite stable. You're going to see trading in soybean and other agricultural products will definitely continue.
Guys, let's go back to Brasilia, where the Chinese president is stepping out of the plane. He has just landed there in Brasilia, kicking off his official state visit to Brazil. This is the Chinese president's 5th visit to Brazil, and this year marks the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and Brazil, adding just something special to this very important state visit. And in Xi's written statement upon his arrival in Rio de Janeiro, he voiced his hope that the visit will further strengthen the two countries' strategic mutual trust, deepen exchanges and cooperation in various fields, and usher in a new golden 50 years for bilateral relations. Obviously, Brazilian officials are there at the airport welcoming the visiting Chinese president.
And during his trip there, he will certainly be met with Brazilian President Lula, and they will be talking about issues of mutual concern as well as those matter to the rest of the world. So we just talked about how trade had been gaining momentum. Two sides are trying to diversify their trade, and also, some of the other areas, the fight against hunger and poverty. We also want to mention now about people-to-people exchanges between the two countries. President Xi is no stranger to Brazil, 5th time there, and he also called Brazil the land of passion. Mr. Zabeto, you've been in China for 9 years now. I'm sure you've noticed so many changes in terms of culture. Tell us about your thoughts on this.
About specifically China or Brazil? Or
Brazilian-China cultural exchanges and people-to-people.
Okay. Well, I see that in artistic field, that more interest in Brazil about Chinese arts, Chinese traditions, art crafts. And here in China, I see also, for example, we had an interesting exhibition about design by famous Brazilian designers in Shanghai. It called a big attention in the city from. So I feel that also in academic field, Brazilian, I see that I'm always in touch with Brazilian students here in China, and I see more Chinese students going to Brazil as well. The university where I graduated in Brazil, I remember basically almost no Chinese student there in my time as a graduation student. But nowadays you go there, lots of Chinese students. So we can see that the exchanges are deepening, and this is positive. Also in the past, Brazilian government had the program Science Without Borders, sending lots of students to China. Now it will restart. Brazil will receive more people. Also, I know that here in Beijing and in other cities in China, there are many Brazilian teachers of Portuguese language coming to teach the language. And same in Brazil, the Confucius Institute is doing a very important work to share the Chinese language and culture to the Brazilian people. And more and more Brazilian universities nowadays have a Confucius Institute.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, something that I'm very curious about, because I don't know if you know this, in addition to samba music, there is something else from Brazil that's picking up affection and popularity here in China, and that's the animal of capybaras. They're found in the Amazon, they're found in Brazil. Are they popular in Brazil?
Well, yeah, they exist everywhere in Brazil. It's a very, very common animal, you know. For Brazilians, it's a normal.
Do you have to go to the zoos to see capybaras, or
no?
They're just out in the wild.
Yeah, like for example, in the university where I graduated, there is a lake next to the campus and lots of capybaras that are around. And sometimes they even entered in like to walk around the city, I used to see capybaras almost every day that time. You know, also in my hometown we saw capybaras. You know, it's common even in big cities in Brazil. Sometimes you are walking along a river and you see a capybara. So it's interesting that I saw last year the capybaras started to become popular here in China. You know, and recently President Xi, in his article in Folha de São Paulo, he mentions the capybaras as something from Brazil that is popular in China.
Yes, it's quickly becoming a cultural symbol and even a cultural ambassador, for the friendliness from Brazil, obviously.
Well, it's a long trip back home, isn't it? I know you're from Sao Paulo, and tell us about the traveling time from Beijing, the round trip. How far is it?
Well, you need to take a flight to one place in the middle of the way and then another one, but it takes around more than 20 hours, only in the airplane, around 22 hours, I guess, and plus the time of the stopover. So that's it. There are different ways to go there, basically through Europe or through Africa, Ethiopia or Middle East. And there are people who take also the routes through North America, but I never tried North America.
How nice would it be to have a direct flight, but it's too far.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe with that development in biofuel and all of that, could we one day maybe have a direct flight?
Hopefully, and more tourists would love to.
Absolutely.
So appealing.
I did one trip to Rio de Janeiro one time. It was a long trip. I make a transit in Dubai. This was quite a few years ago. Speaking of people-to-people exchange, I know several years ago, the Brazilian national diving team, they took the entire team to China to be trained at Tsinghua University for, I think, for a couple of months. So, this is a very good example of people-to-people exchange, I think.
Yeah.
All right, we appreciate those beautiful stories and examples from both of you gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for your analysis.
And with that, we come to our special coverage this hour. CGTN will continue to bring you details on the state visit by the Chinese president to Brazil. Make sure you stay with us.
Do follow us on our social media platforms as well. Thanks for your company. I'm Wang Mumang.
I'm Zheng Shi. Bye for now.
Goodbye.